It's Patrick from Patrick Friends Music Company, and today we're going to talk about how to use scales and arpeggios in your solos. Now we're going to be building upon our last video where we talked about how to develop vocabulary and how important that is to learning how to solo. So make sure you check that video out. I'll include a link in the description below. There's many different ways to use scales and arpeggios in your solos. However, we're going to talk about two specific ways today. The first of that is as a source of vocabulary in itself, and the second is to go from one melody note to the next melody note in your solo. Now, I do want to mention that it's really important to practice your scales and arpeggios separately away from your soloing. And this is because to be able to solo really effectively and to be able to improvise really effectively, you don't want to have to think about your scale, think about your arpeggio. You want them to be underneath your fingers already. Now, if you do learn enough solos, you can kind of pick up scales and sort of learn scales backwards in a way. However, this is probably not the most effective way, and so I do think it's important to practice your scales and arpeggios by themselves. For a quick overview, in terms of soloing, scales and arpeggios are really useful for knowing what notes work with that specific song, whether it's the specific key, whether it's the chord, or chord progression, or mode, and so on. Now, scales are the notes of a key or a mode going from the first note to the last note in order. And arpeggios are when you take a chord and break up the notes and play one after the other. So for instance, if we have a C major chord, it's made of the notes C, E, and G. If you play those together, it's a C major chord. If you play those melodically, one after the other, it's a C major arpeggio. Like I mentioned, the first way we're going to talk about how to use scales and arpeggios is as a source of vocabulary in themselves. So you might hear solos just use a scale, just use an arpeggio, or maybe a fragment of a scale or a fragment of an arpeggio as their vocabulary. So if you hear that, you might hear something like this. Now, all I did there is I went down my G minor pentatonic scale. However, I didn't just play it like an exercise. I used different rhythms and accents to make it sound like something you could actually use in a solo. Now, the big question is, how do you figure out how to do that? How do you just pick up what rhythm should I play? When should I use it? What should I accent? Well, today I really want to focus on the rhythm aspect, and there's many different ways you can practice this. The first and probably the best way to learn how to do this is to steal from your favorite guitarists, steal from your favorite musicians. This is what we talked about doing in our vocabulary video. The best guitarists of all time know how to use rhythm, know how to use scales and arpeggios in their solos. So see how they use these devices and see how they incorporate rhythm into it and try to steal it. Try to take that idea, try to take that concept and put it in your own playing. However, there are definitive practice strategies that you can use to really start incorporating rhythm into your scale and arpeggio playing. So a lot of times we might just practice a scale like this. And that's how you should practice. You want to play your scales evenly, cleanly, and smoothly. However, to get us out of that funk of just practicing and playing our scales like that, what we should do is incorporate rhythm. So what we're going to do now is we're going to play our G minor pentatonic scale, except we're going to continually play a rhythm through it. What we're going to do is play a quarter note followed by 2 eighth notes and just repeat this throughout our first shape in our G minor pentatonic scale. Now let's try the same thing except with a 2-octave G minor arpeggio, playing that same rhythm, quarter note followed by 2 eighth notes. So this can really help us break out of that funk and just really get our ears thinking of different ways to play our scales and arpeggios. Let's actually try another way. Instead of starting on the downbeat, so just starting on beat 1, we're actually going to start on our upbeat, the end of 1. And we're going to sort of flip our rhythm around. We're going to play 2 eighth notes followed by a quarter note. So our rhythm is going to sound like this. And 2 end, and 3 end, and 4 end, and 1 end, and continually up and down our scale. Let's see what this sounds like. Again, let's try the same thing, except on our 2-octave G minor arpeggio. Let's see what this sounds like. When you hear these specific rhythms played in a solo, you're not necessarily just going to hear the scale or arpeggio just using this rhythm. You're going to hear it a lot of times incorporated into a phrase. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a couple phrases that can be used using these rhythms. I'm going to start off with our first rhythm with our scale, then our second rhythm with our scale, then our first rhythm with arpeggio, and the second rhythm with arpeggio. Each time I'm going to sort of answer it with a response to our rhythm, a response to our sort of lick to sort of end it and make it a complete phrase. Now it's important to note that scales and arpeggios aren't just always played going up and then down. A lot of times there's twists and turns in your phrase or your line within that scale or arpeggio to create a little more interesting line, a little more interesting melodic idea. A lot of times these are referred to as patterns. So we talked about patterns in one of our videos, and a common pattern that you'll hear being used is called up 3, back 1. This means going up 3 notes, going back to your previous note, and then up 3 notes from there. So in a scale, it might sound like this. And then in an arpeggio, it might sound like this. So again, I'm going up 3 notes, back to my previous note, and then up 3 notes from there. And again, this creates a little more interesting melodic idea. Now to cycle this all back, I know I'm going to repeat it again, but it's really important to learn from the greats, to learn from your favorite musicians. And a good example of how to do this is the first opening phrase to the Stairway to Heaven solo by Jimmy Page. So that first sort of phrase sounds like this. What I want to do is I want to take a look at not even the entire phrase, just that sort of first part where he's using that A minor pentatonic scale going down. So if we start on the second note of the solo, the 5th fret of the high E string, what he does is he goes down his A minor pentatonic scale. So he starts on that 5th fret, then he plays his next 2 notes, pulling off from the 8th to the 5th fret. Then he goes to the G string, pulling off from the 7th to the 5th fret, and then back down to an A on the 7th fret of the D string. So again, it sounds like this. Now what you can do is you can take that same idea and sort of transfer it to different keys. So let's take it down 2 frets and put it in G minor. So starting on the 3rd fret of the high E, pulling off 6 to 3 on the B, 5 to 3 on the G, and down to the 5th fret on our D string. And then you can move this to other places in your guitar. Just getting really used to how he uses his scale in his solo. Now, what you can also do is take the same idea and take the same concept and start on different notes or different shapes of your pentatonic scale. So what I want to try to do is take that same exact concept, same exact idea, except start on the 5th fret of the B string. So we're going to stay in our A minor pentatonic scale, the first shape, play the 5th fret of the B string, pull off 7 to 5 on the G, our next 2 notes, 7 to 5 on the D, and end on the 7th fret of our A string. Then you take the same concept, move to different keys. This is a great way to really pick up on how someone like Jimmy Page uses scales within his solo. Now, the second way I want to talk about how to use scales and arpeggios in your solo is going from one melody note to the next melody note. Then when I mean melody, I really mean melody. A lot of times soloing, specifically improvisation, is referred to as spontaneous composition. Now, even when you write out a solo, it still wants to feel composed. And a big part of composition is melody. So a melody might have 2 notes that are maybe held out like this. So right there I'm playing G and then D, 5th fret of my D string, 3rd fret of my B string for the D. And that might sound great in a melody and maybe even sort of a more melodic sounding solo. However, a lot of times to make it sound a little more soloistic, you want to sort of have a filler between those two notes. You want to be able to get from one note to the next note in a little more interesting way. So what we can do is we can take it through different ideas and different concepts and try to come up with different ways to get from our starting note to our target melody note. Now, the first way can just be with a G minor pentatonic scale, something like this. Now let's try using a G minor scale, just a natural minor scale. Let's try an arpeggio, G minor arpeggio. Now let's try something a little more interesting. Let's go up past our note. We're actually going to hit it, but we're not going to land on it. Then we're going to go above it and then go back down using our scale and sort of a little pattern in it. Let's see what this sounds like. Again, makes our melody, makes our solo a little more interesting. And I think this can be a lot of fun. If you pick 2 melody notes that you want in your solo and try to come up with as many different ways and maybe even as many different styles, trying to get from one melody note to the next melody note. So try this and see how much fun you can have with it. Scales and arpeggios are a really great way to build up a technical facility on your instrument. However, they're also really, really useful when soloing or learning how to solo. Now, the two ways we talked about using them today is as a source of vocabulary in itself, and also a way to go from one melody note to the next melody note. So really have fun with this and come up with as many ideas as you can using these two concepts. I hope to see you in the next video, but in the meantime, happy practicing.